On October 25th, 1415, one of the most famous battles in English history took place near the small French village of Agincourt. In the midst of the Hundred Years' War, King Henry V of England led a vastly outnumbered and exhausted army against the French forces of Charles d'Albret. The English army, weakened by disease and hunger, faced certain annihilation at the hands of the French. But thanks to the remarkable skill and discipline of their longbowmen, the English achieved an improbable victory, slaughtering thousands of French knights and securing their place in history. Yet, long after the blood-soaked fields of Agincourt were cleared of the dead, rumors of supernatural events began to emerge. Travelers and locals alike spoke of strange figures seen at dusk, archers standing silently in the mist, their longbows poised and ready. Some reported hearing the twang of bowstrings in the night air, followed by the cries of men who were no longer there. The legends tell of the restless spirits of English longbowmen, doomed to forever fight on the fields where they helped turn the tide of history. These ghostly tales, passed down through generations, suggest that the battle's legacy is not confined to history books. In this collection, we recount 4 eerie encounters with the phantom archers of Agincourt, stories of those who have come face to face with the spectral soldiers who still roam the fields of northern France. Story 1: The Ghostly Volley at the Forest's Edge. The fields of Agincourt are quiet most of the year, their serene beauty betraying little of the blood-soaked history embedded in the soil. But the locals know better. They have always whispered that something is wrong with the land, that the past has not let go of it, and that the dead are still restless. For generations, farmers and travelers alike have spoken of strange sights and sounds, the clatter of unseen battle, the thrum of invisible arrows cutting through the air, and the soft voices of soldiers long dead, carried on the wind. In 1897, Louis Dubois, a French farmer, was one such man who had heard the stories. He had grown up in the shadow of Agincourt's legacy, walking the fields where his ancestors had toiled and in some cases fought. To him, the stories of ghostly archers were nothing more than peasant superstition passed down through generations to frighten children. But like many before him, Louis would soon learn that not all legends are just stories. It was late October, and the weather was unseasonably warm. Louis had spent the better part of the day harvesting crops on the outskirts of Agincourt, working quickly to gather the last of the year's yield before the first frost. The sun had set earlier than usual, hidden behind thick clouds, and the horizon was quickly swallowed by darkness. As dusk approached, a heavy fog began to creep across the fields, curling around the trees and rolling in from the nearby forest. The temperature dropped abruptly, and a chill settled over the land. Louis felt the fog long before he saw it. The cold, damp air pressed against his skin, and an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. Something was different about tonight. The air felt too still, too quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He hitched his horse to his wagon, ready to make the journey back to his farmhouse. The fog was thick now, and visibility was poor. The lantern hanging from the front of the wagon cast only a weak glow, barely illuminating the path ahead. Louis shivered, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders, and began the slow journey home. But as he made his way across the fields, the quiet was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. At first, it was faint, so faint that Louis thought he had imagined it. A distant, rhythmic sound carried on the wind. It reminded him of the echo of a hunting bow, the familiar snap of the string followed by the whistle of an arrow in flight, but it was too loud, too frequent to be a hunter. The sound came again, this time more clearly, and Louis froze in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. The unmistakable thrum of bowstrings being drawn and released filled the air, followed by the dull thud of arrows striking targets. Louis knew that sound well. He had hunted with a bow for years, but this was different. It was louder, sharper, as if dozens of archers were loosing arrows all at once. He turned in his seat, scanning the fog for any sign of movement, but the mist was too thick, and the fields were empty. There was no one in sight. Louis's horse snorted, its breath visible in the cold air, and stamped its hooves nervously. The sound of arrows flying through the air grew louder, more insistent, as if an invisible battle was being fought just beyond the reach of his lantern's light. Panic surged through him. He had heard the stories of Agincourt's ghostly archers, but he had never believed them. Now, standing alone in the fog, with the eerie sounds of battle filling the night, he wasn't so sure. "C'est pas possible," he muttered under his breath, trying to calm himself. This couldn't be real. It had to be the wind, or perhaps a group of hunters nearby. But deep down, he knew the truth. The dead were restless tonight. Louis gripped the reins of his horse, ready to flee, but before he could move, the fog shifted. The swirling mist parted like a curtain, revealing a sight that made his heart stop. At the edge of the forest, standing in the gloom, were figures pale and translucent, their forms barely visible through the thick fog. They were dressed in the simple tunics and leggings of medieval soldiers, their longbows held aloft, their faces grim and determined. There were dozens of them, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of focus, as if they were not entirely part of this world. Louis stared in disbelief as the archers moved in unison, raising their bows and drawing the strings back in perfect synchronization. The sound of the bowstrings snapping taut echoed across the field, and Louis flinched as they released a volley of arrows into the mist. The arrows flew silently through the air, vanishing into the fog without ever striking a target. The archers stood motionless for a moment, their faces expressionless, before drawing their bows again. Louis's horse reared back, sensing the unnatural presence, and Louis struggled to keep it under control. His hands shook as he tried to turn the wagon around, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. He had to get away from here, away from the ghostly figures and the eerie sounds of battle that surrounded him. But just as he was about to flee, one of the archers turned its head. The figure's face was pale, almost featureless, but its eyes hollow and empty, locked onto Louis with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The archer's gaze was cold, unblinking, as if it were looking straight through him. Louis felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, as if he were being judged, weighed, by a presence far older and more powerful than anything he had ever known. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The sound of the bowstrings, the wind, even the beating of his own heart all fell silent as the ghostly archer continued to stare. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, the archer raised its bow once more, aiming directly at Louis. Louis's breath caught in his throat. The spectral figure released its arrow, and though he couldn't see the arrow itself, he felt the rush of cold air as it flew past him, barely missing his head. The spell was broken. Louis snapped the reins, urging his horse forward, and the wagon lurched into motion. He didn't look back. The sound of arrows continued to fill the air, but he forced himself to focus on the road ahead, his only thought to get away from the horrors he had just witnessed. The wagon raced across the field, the wheels bouncing over the uneven ground as Louis urged his horse to go faster. The fog was thick, swallowing the light from his lantern, and for a moment Louis feared he would lose his way. But the sounds of the spectral archers grew fainter, their eerie volleys fading into the distance as he put more ground between himself and the forest. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. He could still see the ghostly figures in his mind's eye, their pale forms, their empty eyes, and the strange mechanical way they moved. It was as if they were trapped in time, forever doomed to repeat the same actions over and over again. By the time Louis reached his farmhouse, his body was trembling with exhaustion and fear. He stumbled from the wagon, barely managing to tie up his horse before collapsing against the door. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Had it all been real? Had he truly seen the ghosts of the English archers who had fought at Agincourt so many centuries ago? Or was it some kind of hallucination, brought on by the fog and the darkness? Louis didn't know, but one thing was certain: he would never forget what he had seen. The next morning, Louis tried to go about his usual routine, but the events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the ghostly archers, the sound of their bows, the cold gaze of the one who had aimed directly at him. Word of Louis's experience quickly spread through the village. Some dismissed it as the fanciful tale of an old man with an overactive imagination, but others took it more seriously. The stories of Agincourt's ghosts were well known in the region, and many believed that Louis had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite the skepticism of some, Louis knew what he had seen. He had witnessed something supernatural, something that defied explanation. And though he rarely spoke of it in the years that followed, he never again ventured near the forest after dark. For the rest of his life, Louis would be haunted by the memory of that night, the eerie stillness of the fog, the sound of invisible arrows cutting through the air, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the ghostly archer who had aimed at him. In the years following Louis's encounter, more and more people began to report strange occurrences near the fields of Agincourt. Travelers passing through the area at dusk spoke of hearing the faint sounds of battle bowstrings snapping, the cries of wounded men, and the dull thud of arrows striking invisible targets. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving through the mist, their forms flickering like shadows on the edge of perception. The stories spread, drawing the attention of historians and paranormal investigators alike. Some believed that the spirits of the English archers were still tied to the battlefield, their souls unable to rest after the violence and bloodshed they had witnessed. Others suggested that the ghostly apparitions were a form of residual haunting, a kind of echo left behind by the traumatic events of the battle. Despite the various theories, no one could offer a definitive explanation for the strange phenomena. The fields of Agincourt remained a place of mystery, a place where the past seemed to bleed into the present. By the early 20th century, the legend of the ghostly archers had become a part of local folklore, passed down from one generation to the next. But while many treated the stories as mere superstition, others took them more seriously, particularly those who had experienced the supernatural events firsthand. In 1936, a young man named Pierre Boucher, the grandson of Louis Dubois, had his own encounter with the ghosts of Agincourt. Like his grandfather before him, Pierre had grown up hearing the stories of the ghostly archers, but he had never given them much thought. That all changed one froggy evening in late October, when Pierre found himself walking the same path his grandfather had taken nearly 40 years earlier. The fog was thick, the air heavy with moisture, and Pierre could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. As he made his way through the fields, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable twang of bowstrings, followed by the soft whoosh of arrows cutting through the air. His heart raced as he turned in the direction of the sound, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. And there, at the edge of the forest, he saw them, the same ghostly figures his grandfather had described, their longbows raised, their pale forms flickering in the mist. Pierre stood frozen, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. He had always dismissed the stories as nonsense, but now, standing face to face with the spectral archers, he realized that the legends were true. The past had not let go of Agincourt. The ghosts of the battle still lingered, trapped in an endless cycle of violence and death, and they were not alone. Unlike his grandfather, Pierre did not flee. Instead, he stood his ground, watching as the archers moved in unison, losing volley after volley of arrows into the mist. He could hear the soft murmur of their voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand, Old English, perhaps, or the dialect of the medieval French soldiers who had fought alongside them. As the archers prepared to fire another volley, Pierre felt a strange pull, a sense of connection to the past that he couldn't explain. It was as if the spirits were trying to communicate with him, to show him something he had yet to understand. Slowly, cautiously, Pierre took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The archers did not seem to notice him, their attention focused on some unseen enemy in the distance. But as he drew closer, one of the archers, taller than the rest, with a more commanding presence, turned its head. The figure's eyes locked onto Pierre's, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Pierre felt a surge of emotion, grief, anger, fear all at once, as if he were experiencing the memories of the long-dead archer. The weight of history pressed down on him, and he struggled to catch his breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the connection was broken. The ghostly archer turned back to the battlefield, raising its bow once more. Pierre stumbled back, his heart racing. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. The the spirits of Agincourt were not at peace. As the ghostly archers continued their silent battle, Pierre knew it was time to leave. The weight of the past was too much for him to bear, and the presence of the spirits filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing through the mist as he ran back toward the village. The sound of the bowstrings faded behind him, replaced by the steady beat of his own heart. By the time he reached the safety of his home, Pierre was trembling with exhaustion. He had seen the ghosts of Agincourt with his own eyes, and he knew that he would never forget the experience. For the rest of his life, Pierre carried the memory of that night with him, the sight of the ghostly archers, the strange connection he had felt to the past, and the realization that the spirits of Agincourt were still trapped in a battle that would never end. The story of the ghostly archers of Agincourt has endured for centuries, passed down through generations of farmers, travelers, and historians. Some believe that the spirits are trapped, forever reliving the events of that fateful day in 1415. Others suggest that the ghosts are a reminder of the horrors of war, a lingering echo of the violence and bloodshed that took place on those fields. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: the fields of Agincourt are haunted. The past has not let go, and the ghosts of the battle still roam the land, their bows drawn, their arrows ready to fly. And for those who are brave enough to venture into the fog at dusk, there is always the chance that they too will hear the twang of bowstrings and see the flickering forms of the long-dead archers who still fight on the fields of northern France. Story 2: The Soldier and the Silent Battalion. In 1917, the world was entrenched in the bloodiest conflict it had ever known, World War I. The rolling fields of northern France, once quiet and serene, were now scarred by trenches, barbed wire, and artillery craters. The land, which had witnessed centuries of conflict, was once again a battleground. British, French, and German forces clashed in a war of attrition, each side digging deeper into the earth as they tried to gain even the smallest advantage. For Private Arthur Whitlock, a young British soldier stationed near the village of Agincourt, the war had become a grim reality. He had been on the front lines for nearly a year, and the horrors of trench warfare had already taken their toll. Death was a constant companion, and the mud, the cold, and the relentless artillery fire weighed heavily on his mind. But even in the midst of modern warfare, history seemed to linger just below the surface. Arthur knew that the fields near Agincourt had been the site of a famous battle centuries earlier. In 1415, King Henry V of England had led a small, outnumbered army to victory against the French in a battle that would go down in history as one of England's greatest triumphs. The English longbowmen, with their deadly volleys of arrows, had decimated the French cavalry, and the name Agincourt had become synonymous with English military prowess. But for Arthur, the distant past felt irrelevant in the face of the immediate dangers of war. He was more concerned with surviving the next day than with the ghosts of battles long since past. That was until one cold November night when the past and present collided in a way Arthur could never have anticipated. It was a bitterly cold evening, and the wind howled through the trenches, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and gunpowder. The men in Arthur's unit had spent the day fortifying their position, digging deeper into the mud, and reinforcing the barbed wire that lined the perimeter of their trench. They had been warned of a possible German offensive in the coming days, and tensions were high. Arthur had drawn the short straw and found himself on night watch, standing at the edge of the trench near a stretch of no man's land that lay between the British and German lines. His rifle was slung across his shoulder, and he stood shivering in the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air. The landscape around him was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of battle, the crack of rifle fire, the distant rumble of artillery had faded, leaving behind only the low moan of the wind as it swept across the open fields. A thick fog had begun to settle over the land, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The familiar shapes of the battlefield, twisted trees, barbed wire, and the jagged outlines of shell craters were slowly swallowed by the mist. Arthur tried to keep his focus, but his thoughts kept drifting to home. He missed the simple comforts of life in England, the warm hearth of his family's cottage, the smell of fresh bread, and the sound of his mother's voice. He thought of the rolling hills of the countryside, far removed from the death and destruction of the trenches. As the fog thickened, Arthur's mind wandered further, and for a moment, he imagined that the battlefield before him was not the shattered landscape of World War I, but the fields of Agincourt, as they might have looked centuries ago, before the war. It was a fleeting thought, but one that would soon seem far more real than he could have ever imagined. The first sound Arthur heard was faint, so soft that he thought he had imagined it. It was a low, rhythmic noise, like the steady beat of footsteps marching in unison. He frowned, his heart skipping a beat as he strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was coming from no man's land. Arthur's pulse quickened as the sound grew louder. It wasn't the heavy, plodding steps of modern soldiers in boots and thick coats. No, this was something different, lighter, quicker, as if a group of men were marching in formation, their movements graceful and precise. He squinted into the fog, but the mist was too thick. He could barely make out the ground in front of him, let alone the distant shapes of any soldiers. But the sound of marching was unmistakable now, growing closer with each passing moment. A sudden fear gripped Arthur's heart. Was it a German patrol? Had they crossed into no man's land under cover of fog, preparing to launch a surprise attack on the British trenches? He raised his rifle, his hands trembling as he scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. His finger hovered over the trigger, ready to fire at the first glimpse of the enemy. But then he saw them. Through the thick fog, faint shapes began to emerge, men, marching in perfect formation. They moved silently, their footsteps barely disturbing the ground beneath them. As they drew closer, Arthur's breath caught in his throat. They were not modern soldiers. These men were dressed in medieval armor, their tunics emblazoned with the symbols of a long-forgotten age. Each man carried a longbow over his shoulder, and quivers full of arrows hung at their sides. Their faces were shadowed by helmets, but their eyes, cold, empty, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Arthur's hands shook as he lowered his rifle. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. This was impossible. These were the longbowmen of Agincourt, the soldiers who had fought and died centuries ago. And yet, here they were, marching silently through the fog, their bows drawn as if ready for battle. The ghostly battalion moved as one, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on some distant point ahead. They made no sound, save for the soft rustle of their clothing and the faint creak of their bows. Arthur stood frozen, unable to move, his heart hammering in his chest. He watched in stunned silence as the ghostly archers passed by him, their figures flickering like shadows in the mist. As the archers marched past, Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. There was something unnatural about the way they moved, their bodies too still, too rigid. It was as if they were trapped in time, forever doomed to repeat the same movements over and over again. But there was something else too, something that made Arthur's skin crawl. It wasn't just the sight of the ghostly battalion that terrified him. It was the feeling that they were aware of him, that they could see him, even though they did not turn their heads or acknowledge his presence. The cold air seemed to press down on him, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Arthur felt as though he were a part of their world, pulled into the past, into the battle they had fought so many centuries ago. His mind raced with questions. Why were they here? Why had they appeared to him? And what were they looking for? The archers continued their silent march, their figures fading into the fog as they moved further away. But just as the last of them passed by, one of the archers stopped. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto his. The archer's face was pale, almost translucent, and his expression was one of deep sorrow. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Arthur felt a strange connection to the ghostly figure, as if he could sense the weight of the archer's memories, the fear, the pain, the desperate hope that had driven him to fight in a battle long forgotten by time. The archer held Arthur's gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his bow. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as the archer drew back the string, his eyes never leaving Arthur's. The air grew colder still, and the fog seemed to close in around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment was over. The archer lowered his bow, turned, and marched silently after his comrades, disappearing into the mist. Arthur stood frozen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had never believed in ghosts before, but now there was no denying what he had seen. The longbowmen of Agincourt were real, and they were still marching across the fields where they had once fought and died. For the rest of the night, Arthur could not shake the image of the ghostly archers from his mind. Even as the fog began to lift and the sounds of battle resumed in the distance, he remained haunted by the memory of their pale faces, their empty eyes, and the strange connection he had felt to the archer who had stopped to look at him. He kept replaying the scene over and over, wondering if it had been a hallucination, a trick of the fog in his weary mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. What he had seen was real. When his watch finally ended, Arthur returned to the trench, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He didn't speak of what he had seen, not to his fellow soldiers, not even to his commanding officer. The memory was too raw, too strange, and he feared that no one would believe him if he told them. But Arthur wasn't the only one to experience strange phenomena on the fields of Agincourt. Over the next few weeks, other soldiers in his unit began to report hearing strange sounds in the night: footsteps, the twang of bowstrings, and the soft whoosh of arrows flying through the air. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving through the mist, their forms flickering like shadows in the half-light. The stories spread quickly, and soon the men began to avoid the area where Arthur had seen the battalion. They spoke of the ghosts of Agincourt with a mixture of fear and reverence, as if the spirits of the past were watching over them, judging their actions in the present. Months passed, and the war dragged on. Arthur continued to fight alongside his comrades, but the memory of the ghostly battalion never left him. Every time he stood watch in the trenches, he found himself scanning the horizon for any sign of the longbowmen, half expecting to see their pale forms emerge from the fog once again. The connection he had felt to the archer who had stopped to look at him weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that the archer had seen him and had acknowledged him in a way that no other ghostly figure had. It was as if the archer had recognized something in Arthur, something that tied him to the past, to the battle that had been fought on these fields so many centuries ago. Arthur never spoke of the encounter, but he carried the memory with him for the rest of his life. Even after the war ended and he returned home to England, the image of the ghostly battalion remained vivid in his mind. Years later, as an old man, Arthur would sit by the fire, staring into the flames as he remembered that cold November night on the fields of Agincourt. He would think of the longbowmen, their pale faces, and the strange connection he had felt to the archer who had stopped to look at him. And he would wonder if, even now, the ghosts of Agincourt were still marching across the fields, their bows drawn, their eyes fixed on the horizon, forever waiting for a battle that would never end. The story of the ghostly battalion of Agincourt is a reminder that the past is never truly gone. The longbowmen who fought and died on the fields of northern France still roam the land, their spirits trapped in an endless cycle of battle. For those who have encountered them, the experience is one that leaves a lasting mark, a haunting memory that refuses to fade. The soldiers of World War I who witnessed the spectral march of the longbowmen may be long gone, but the legend endures. To this day, there are those who claim to have heard the faint sound of bowstrings in the night, or seen the ghostly figures of medieval soldiers marching through the mist. The ghosts of Agincourt remain, a silent reminder of the violence and sacrifice that took place on those fields so many centuries ago. Story 3: The Archer in the Chapel. The fields of Agincourt had long held a special place in the heart of Margaret Atkinson, a British historian dedicated to the study of the 100 Years' War. Her fascination with the battle that had taken place there in 1415 stemmed from a deep interest in military history, particularly the role of the English longbowmen. The longbow, a devastating weapon in the hands of skilled archers, had turned the tide of many battles, and Agincourt was the most famous of them all. Margaret had spent years studying the tactics employed by Henry IV and his army, analyzing how the English forces had managed to defeat a much larger French force through cunning strategy, discipline, and the lethal efficiency of their archers. In 1952, Margaret had the opportunity to visit Agincourt for the first time, as part of her research for a book she was writing on the battle. The small village had changed little since the Middle Ages, with its narrow streets, ancient stone buildings, and rolling fields that stretched out toward the horizon. The landscape had borne witness to centuries of history, but to Margaret, it was the events of that single day in 1415 that fascinated her most. For days, Margaret explored the battlefield, walking the ground where English and French soldiers had once clashed. She visited the site of Henry's encampment, stood on the ridge where the English archers had taken their position, and marveled at how the terrain itself had played a role in the English victory. The land had helped funnel the French cavalry into the killing zones created by the longbowmen, turning their numbers against them. But it wasn't just the tactical elements of the battle that intrigued Margaret. There was something about Agincourt that felt different, as though the past had left an indelible mark on the land, a scar that time had not yet healed. The air seemed heavy with history, and as she walked the fields, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by unseen eyes. Her journey culminated in a visit to the village's ancient chapel, where, according to legend, many of the wounded soldiers had been taken in the aftermath of the battle. It was a place steeped in reverence, a sanctuary for the dead, and it was here that Margaret would come face to face with the very history she had devoted her life to studying. The chapel of Agincourt was small and unassuming, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. It stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by overgrown grass and ancient gravestones, a quiet testament to the past. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of incense lingering from the daily prayers of the villagers. Margaret had read that after the battle, the chapel had served as a makeshift hospital, where English and French wounded had been laid side by side, their differences forgotten in the face of death and suffering. She imagined the blood-stained floors, the cries of dying men, and the hurried footsteps of priests tending to the wounded. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. As she entered the chapel, her footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor. The interior was dimly lit by a few flickering candles, casting long shadows across the walls. Margaret moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes drawn to the altar at the front of the chapel, where a single figure knelt in silent prayer. At first, she thought the figure was a villager, perhaps a man coming to pay his respects to those who had died on this very ground centuries before. But as she approached, something about the figure caught her attention. His clothing was strange, unlike anything she had seen in modern times. He wore a long, tattered cloak, made of rough wool, and his boots were tall, made of worn leather that looked as though it had seen years of use. Margaret's heart began to race as she drew closer. The man's head was bowed, and a hood covered most of his face, but there was something unmistakably old-fashioned about his appearance. It was as though he had stepped out of the past, his presence out of place in the modern world. And then she saw the longbow. It was slung over his shoulder, the wood darkened with age, and a quiver full of arrows was strapped to his back. The sight of the weapon sent a jolt of recognition through Margaret. This was no ordinary visitor. This was one of the English longbowmen, a ghost from the Battle of Agincourt. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure remained kneeling at the altar, his head bowed, as if lost in prayer. She couldn't see his face, but the longbow and arrows were unmistakable. This was one of the archers who had fought and perhaps died at Agincourt. The realization sent a wave of both awe and terror through her. She stood motionless, her mind racing with questions. How could this be? How could a man from the 15th century be kneeling here in the chapel, his form as solid and real as her own? The ghostly figure remained silent, unmoving, as if unaware of her presence. Margaret took a cautious step closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and the faint smell of damp earth filled her nostrils. "Excuse me," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. The figure did not respond. Margaret took another step, her eyes fixed on the longbow slung across the man's back. She had spent years studying weapons like this, poring over manuscripts and illustrations, but she had never seen one so close, so real. It was as though history had come to life before her eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The ghostly archer remained silent, his head still bowed in prayer. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she took another step closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached out a trembling hand, unsure of what she was hoping to accomplish. Would her hand pass through him, like mist, or would she feel the rough texture of his cloak beneath her fingers? Just as her fingertips were about to brush the edge of his cloak, the archer stirred. Margaret gasped and stumbled back, her pulse racing. The figure rose slowly from his knees, his movements fluid but deliberate, as though he were weighed down by centuries of sorrow. He turned toward her, and for the first time, Margaret saw his face. The ghostly archer's face was pale, almost gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken, as if he had not slept in centuries. His features were sharp, angular, with a thin, unkempt beard that framed his jaw. His expression was one of deep sadness, as though the weight of the battle he had fought so long ago still pressed heavily upon him. But it was his eyes that held Margaret's attention. They were dark, almost black, and they seemed to burn with an intensity that made her heart race. There was something in those eyes, something ancient, something haunted. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in silence, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across the chapel walls. Margaret could feel the cold seeping into her bones, and the weight of history pressed down on her. She knew she was standing in the presence of something extraordinary, something beyond the bounds of ordinary life. The ghostly archer did not speak, but his gaze remained locked on hers, as if he were searching for something in her face, something he had lost long ago. Margaret felt a strange connection to him, as though she were not just a witness to his ghostly presence, but a part of his story. I know who you are," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "You fought at Agincourt, didn't you?" The archer's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Margaret thought she saw a spark of recognition in his gaze. But he did not answer. Instead, he turned away from her, his gaze shifting back to the altar. Margaret watched in stunned silence as the archer raised his longbow and laid it gently on the stone steps before the altar, as though offering it up in silent penance. The gesture sent a chill down Margaret's spine. It was as if the archer were asking for forgiveness, seeking redemption for the lives he had taken in battle. "Why are you here?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. The ghostly archer did not respond. He knelt once more before the altar, his head bowed in silent prayer, as if the weight of his past sins was too great to bear. Margaret felt her heart ache as she watched the ghostly archer, his form flickering faintly in the dim light. She had spent her life studying the history of battles like Agincourt, but standing here in the presence of one of the men who had fought in that terrible conflict, she realized that she had never truly understood the human cost of war. This man, this archer, had once been a living, breathing person, with hopes, fears, and dreams. He had stood on the battlefield, drawing his bow and losing his arrows, knowing that each one would end a life. He had been part of a victory that had shaped the course of history, but at what cost? How many men had died by his hand? How many lives had he destroyed? Margaret felt a deep sense of sorrow for the ghostly archer, for the burden he still carried centuries after his death. She wondered if he had ever found peace, or if he was doomed to wander the earth, forever seeking redemption for the blood he had spilled. She took a step closer, her voice soft but filled with compassion. "It wasn't your fault. You were a soldier. You were following orders." The archer's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, Margaret thought he might respond. But he remained silent, his head bowed in prayer. Margaret's heart ached for him, but she knew there was nothing she could do to help him. His pain was his own, and it was tied to a past she could never fully understand. Slowly, she backed away, her eyes never leaving the ghostly figure. She felt as though she were intruding on something sacred, something private. The archer's battle was not yet over, and it was one he would have to fight alone. Margaret left the chapel that day with a heavy heart. The image of the ghostly archer burned into her memory. She returned to England and continued her work on her book, but she could never shake the feeling that she had witnessed something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of ordinary life. The archer had been real. She was certain of that. And though she had never seen him again, she knew that he was still there, kneeling in the chapel, his longbow laid at the altar, seeking forgiveness for the sins of his past. Over the years, Margaret's experience became part of the growing legend of the ghostly archers of Agincourt. As others who visited the chapel claimed to have seen the same figure, a man dressed in medieval clothing, kneeling in silent prayer before the altar. Some even said they had heard the faint twang of a longbow being drawn, followed by the soft whoosh of an arrow flying through the air. But none of these accounts carried the same weight as Margaret's. She had stood face to face with the ghostly archer, had seen the sorrow in his eyes, and had felt the burden of his past pressing down on her. She knew that he was not just a figment of her imagination, but a real, tormented soul, trapped between the past and the present. As the years went by, Margaret continued to visit Agincourt, drawn back to the chapel time and time again. She never saw the archer again, but she could feel his presence, lingering in the shadows, watching over the place where he had once prayed. It wasn't until many years later, near the end of her life, that Margaret returned to the chapel one final time. By then, she had grown old, her body frail, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She had finished her book, documenting the history of the battle and the role of the longbowman, but there was one final chapter she had left unwritten. The chapter about the ghostly archer she had seen all those years ago. As she entered the chapel, now older and more weathered than before, Margaret felt a familiar chill in the air. The candles flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the stone floor, and the air was heavy with the scent of incense. She made her way slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. And there, at the altar, knelt the ghostly archer. His form was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but he was there, just as he had been on that first day. His longbow lay at his side, and his head was bowed in prayer, his shoulders hunched with the weight of centuries of sorrow. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat as she approached. She had thought she might never see him again, but here he was, still seeking redemption for the lives he had taken in battle. This time she did not speak. She simply knelt beside him, her heart heavy with compassion. She didn't know if he could hear her, if he even knew she was there, but she hoped that her presence would bring him some measure of comfort. For a long time, the two of them knelt in silence, side by side, the living and the dead, connected by a shared understanding of the past. And then, as the candles flickered and the shadows grew longer, the ghostly archer began to fade. His form shimmered, becoming more transparent with each passing moment, until finally he was gone. Margaret remained kneeling, her heart heavy but at peace. She knew that the ghostly archer had finally found the redemption he had been seeking for so long. His battle was over, and he could finally rest. Margaret never spoke of her final encounter with the ghostly archer. It was a moment she kept close to her heart, a private memory that she would carry with her to her grave. But she knew that the archer's story was not over. His spirit had found peace, but the legacy of the battle he had fought and the lives he had taken would live on. The chapel at Agincourt remains a place of quiet reverence, a sanctuary for the living and the dead. Visitors still speak of strange occurrences, the faint sound of a bowstring being drawn, the flicker of a shadow in the corner of their vision, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. And though the ghostly archer may no longer kneel in prayer at the altar, his presence lingers in the air, a reminder of the human cost of war and the long, painful journey toward redemption. The story of the ghostly archer of Agincourt is not just a tale of the supernatural, it is a story of guilt, redemption, and the heavy burden of the past. For centuries, the spirit of the archer had wandered the earth, seeking forgiveness for the lives he had taken in battle. And though he had fought for a noble cause, the weight of his actions had followed him beyond the grave. In the end, it was not history that redeemed him, but the quiet compassion of a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding the past. Margaret Atkinson's encounter with the ghostly archer was more than just a meeting between the living and the dead. It was a moment of connection, a brief glimpse into the soul of a man who had been lost to time. And though the ghostly archer may have found peace, his story endures, a haunting reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that the echoes of history can still be heard, even in the quietest of places. This expanded version of The Archer in the Chapel builds on the emotional and psychological weight of the original story, deepening the connection between Margaret and the ghostly archer. The narrative explores themes of guilt, redemption, and the human cost of war, culminating in a climactic moment of quiet resolution as the archer finally finds peace. Through richly detailed scenes and atmospheric tension, the story creates a haunting, reflective meditation on the lingering effects of history and the souls left behind by the violence of war. Story 4: The Bowmen of the Battlefield. In the summer of 1995, a group of British tourists traveled to northern France to visit the battlefields of the 100 Years' War. Led by Philippe Leclerc, a local historian with a deep knowledge of medieval warfare, the group was eager to learn about one of the most famous victories in English military history, the Battle of Agincourt. Philippe, who had conducted countless tours of the area, was proud to share the rich history of his homeland. He spoke passionately about the tactics, the terrain, and the key moments of the battle, drawing vivid pictures of the events of October 25, 1415, when Henry V's vastly outnumbered army had won an improbable victory over the French. The day had started off warm and sunny, with a clear blue sky stretching overhead. The tour group, made up of families, history enthusiasts, and a few amateur military historians, gathered eagerly around Philippe as he explained how the battle had unfolded. They began by visiting the ridge where the English archers had taken their position, looking down at the fields below, which had once been thick with French knights, horses, and soldiers. Despite the modern-day serenity of the landscape, Philippe spoke of how the ground had been soaked with blood by the end of the battle, littered with the bodies of the French nobility, cut down by the relentless volleys of English longbowmen. He described the muddy conditions of the battlefield, which had trapped the French cavalry and infantry, rendering them helpless before the deadly accuracy of the English archers. The group listened intently, imagining the chaos and carnage that had taken place on those same fields centuries ago. As the day wore on, the group made their way across the battlefield, stopping at various key points to learn about the different phases of the battle. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, casting a shadow over the landscape. The wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that seemed at odds with the warmth of the morning. Philippe noticed the change in the weather, but said nothing. He had guided groups through Agincourt many times, and he knew that sudden shifts in weather were common in the region. Still, there was something about the air that felt different today. It was heavier, more oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The group's next stop was the edge of a small forest that bordered the battlefield, a place where many of the French soldiers had tried to flee during the chaos of the battle. It was here, Philippe explained, that the English longbowmen had loosed some of their deadliest volleys, cutting down the retreating French soldiers as they attempted to escape. As they approached the tree line, the mood of the group began to shift. The jovial conversations and excited questions that had filled the earlier part of the tour began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The air was colder here, and the wind seemed to whistle through the trees with an eerie, mournful sound. Philippe paused at the edge of the forest, turning to address the group. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of seriousness to it now. "This is where many say the spirits of the past still linger," he began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his audience. "The men who died here, particularly the longbowmen, are said to have never truly left. Some believe they still stand watch over this battlefield, protecting it, waiting for a battle that will never come." The group shifted uneasily. Most of them had heard the stories of Agincourt's ghosts, but few had taken them seriously. Yet, standing here at the edge of the forest, with the wind howling through the trees and the sky darkening overhead, the tales didn't seem quite so far-fetched. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. A thick mist began to roll in from the forest, obscuring the edges of the field where the group stood. The temperature dropped sharply, and several of the tourists pulled their jackets tighter, exchanging nervous glances. It felt as though a storm was brewing, but there had been no mention of bad weather in the forecast. Philippe continued speaking, his voice louder now to be heard over the wind. Legend has it that on certain days, when the conditions are just right, you can still hear the sound of the longbowmen firing their arrows. Some even claim to have seen their ghostly figures moving through the mist. The group chuckled nervously, though there was little humor in their laughter. There was something about Philippe's tone that unsettled them. His words felt less like part of a scripted tour and more like a warning. As if in response to his words, a sudden gust of wind swept across the field, carrying with it a strange rhythmic sound, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of bowstrings being drawn back and released, followed by the soft whoosh of arrows cutting through the air. The group froze. Several members of the tour turned toward Philippe, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What was that?" one of them asked, her voice shaking. Philippe frowned, his eyes scanning the tree line. He had heard the stories, of course, but he had never experienced anything like this on any of his previous tours. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound came again, louder this time, as though an unseen army of archers was loosing a volley of arrows into the mist. "It's probably just the wind," Philippe said, though he didn't sound convinced. But the group knew better. The wind didn't sound like that. The sound was too precise, too deliberate, as though it was coming from a group of men hidden just beyond the fog, drawing their bows in perfect unison. The tourists huddled closer together, their eyes darting nervously around the field. Some looked to Philippe for reassurance, but the historian was just as unsettled as they were. The sound of the ghostly bowstrings filled the air again, followed by the faint thud of arrows striking an invisible target. "I think we should head back," one of the men in the group suggested, his voice tight with fear. But before anyone could move, the mist thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. The air grew colder still, and the sound of the bowstrings was joined by another noise, distant and faint, but unmistakable. The sound of men shouting. The shouting grew louder, echoing across the field as though carried on the wind from another time. It was the sound of soldiers calling to one another, issuing commands, their voices strained with fear and desperation. The group stood frozen, their hearts pounding as the ghostly noises surrounded them. There was no doubt now this was no natural phenomenon. Philippe's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's the battle." The tourists turned to him, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What do you mean?" one of them asked, her voice trembling. "It's the battle," Philippe repeated, his gaze fixed on the mist that now enveloped them. "The spirits of the men who died here. They're reliving it." As if on cue, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth filled the air, followed by the clash of swords and the desperate cries of men in combat. The sounds were all around them, coming from the mist, from the trees, from the very ground beneath their feet. The air was thick with the tension of battle, and the tourists could almost see the scene playing out in front of them. The French cavalry charging across the muddy field, the English archers standing their ground, losing volley after volley of arrows into the oncoming enemy. The sound of arrows flying through the air grew louder, more insistent, and several members of the group ducked instinctively, as though fearing they might be struck. But there were no arrows, only the sounds echoing through the mist like a distant memory brought to life. "We need to leave," Philippe said urgently, his voice trembling. He had never believed in the ghost stories he told his tourists, but now, standing in the midst of the phantom battle, he knew that they were real. "We need to get out of here." But before the group could move, the mist parted. From the depths of the swirling fog, figures began to emerge, shadowy, indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. They were men, dressed in the simple tunics and leather armor of medieval soldiers. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow and cold. Each one carried a longbow, the wood darkened with age, and quivers full of arrows hung at their sides. The tourists gasped in horror as the ghostly figures materialized before them, their movements slow and deliberate, as though weighed down by centuries of sorrow. There were dozens of them, an entire company of archers, their forms flickering in and out of focus like shadows caught between worlds. Philippe stumbled backward, his heart racing. He had heard the stories, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The longbowmen of Agincourt, the same soldiers who had fought and died on these very fields nearly 6 centuries ago, were standing before him, their bows drawn, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The tourists huddled together, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Several of them began to whisper prayers, while others simply stood frozen, too terrified to move. The ghostly archers raised their bows in unison, their movements slow and mechanical. The sound of bowstrings being drawn back filled the air, and the tourists could feel the tension building, the weight of history pressing down on them. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The wind died down, the mist hung still in the air, and the sounds of battle faded into silence. And then, with a single deafening crack, the archers released their arrows. The arrows flew silently through the air, their shafts cutting through the mist like ghostly streaks of light. The tourists braced themselves, expecting the arrows to strike them, to feel the sharp sting of death delivered by the hands of the long-dead archers. But no arrows found their mark. Instead, the arrows passed through them, as though they weren't phantom projectiles fired by phantom soldiers. The tourists felt nothing, no impact, no pain, only the cold chill of the mist swirling around them. The ghostly archers did not react to the tourists' presence. Their eyes remained fixed on some unseen enemy, their faces expressionless as they reached for another arrow and drew their bows once more. Philippe's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He had spent his life studying the history of Agincourt, but this was something else entirely. This was history brought to life, or rather, history refusing to die. The tourists stood in stunned silence as the archers continued their ghostly battle, losing volley after volley of arrows into the mist. The sounds of battle returned, louder now, more intense, the clash of swords, the cries of dying men, the thundering hooves of cavalry charging across the field. But none of it was real. It was a memory, a moment frozen in time, replaying itself over and over again on the fields where so many had died. "We need to leave," Philippe whispered, his voice shaking. "Now." The group didn't need to be told twice. With the sounds of battle ringing in their ears and the ghostly archers still firing their arrows, the tourists turned and fled. Philippe led the way, his heart pounding as he ran through the mist, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The air around them seemed to grow colder with each step, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful wail. The sound of arrows flying through the air followed them, relentless and terrifying, as though the phantom archers were chasing them from the battlefield. Philippe didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the cold gaze of the archers watching his every move. The battle was still raging behind them, but it was a battle they could never hope to win. The tourists ran as fast as they could, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in their chests. The mist swirled around them, disorienting them, making it difficult to see where they were going. But Philippe knew the land well, and he led them toward the edge of the battlefield, where the tree line gave way to the open fields beyond. As they reached the safety of the road, the sounds of battle began to fade. The wind died down, the mist thinned, and the ghostly archers disappeared, vanishing into the fog as though they had never been there at all. The group came to a halt, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. They had escaped the battlefield, but the memory of what they had seen would haunt them forever. The tourists were silent as they made their way back to the village, their minds reeling from the events of the day. Some of them still struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed, while others refused to speak of it at all, their faces pale with shock. Philippe, too, was shaken. He had spent years studying the history of Agincourt, but this was the first time he had truly felt its presence, its weight. The ghosts of the past were not just stories, they were real, and they still walked the fields where they had once fought and died. As they reached the village, the group gathered outside a small cafe, seeking warmth and comfort after their harrowing experience. Philippe sat down heavily at one of the tables, his hands trembling as he poured himself a cup of coffee. What was that?" one of the tourists asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Were those real?" Philippe nodded slowly, his eyes distant. They were real, or at least they were once. The group fell into a heavy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The ghosts of Agincourt had shown them a glimpse of the past, a moment frozen in time, replaying itself over and over again on the battlefield. And though the tourists had escaped the phantom battle, they knew that the longbowmen of Agincourt would continue to fight, their spirits bound to the land where they had made their stand so many centuries ago. In the years that followed, the tourists who had witnessed the ghostly archers of Agincourt would speak of their experience only rarely, and only to those who they trusted would believe them. Some of them returned to their normal lives, the memory of that day fading with time, but others were haunted by it, unable to forget the sight of the long-dead archers raising their bows in silent unison. Philippe continued to lead tours of the battlefield, but he was never the same. He no longer spoke of the ghosts of Agincourt as mere legends. He knew, deep in his heart, that they were real, and that they still walked the fields where they had fought and died. To this day, visitors to the battlefield of Agincourt report strange occurrences, disembodied voices, the sound of arrows cutting through the air, and the faint, shadowy figures of men dressed in medieval garb, their longbows drawn, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The ghosts of Agincourt remain, a reminder of a battle long past, a testament to the men who fought and died there. And for those who are brave enough to visit the battlefield at dusk, when the mist rolls in and the wind howls through the trees, there is always the chance that they too will hear the ghostly twang of bowstrings and catch a glimpse of the longbowmen who still stand watch over the fields of northern France. The bowmen of Agincourt are more than just a legend. For those who have encountered them, they are a haunting reminder of the violence and sacrifice that took place on those blood-soaked fields so many centuries ago. The ghostly archers still walk the battlefield, their bows drawn, their arrows ready to fly. Bound to the land by the battle they fought, their spirits cannot rest, and their presence lingers, a testament to the enduring legacy of Agincourt. For those who visit the battlefield, the question remains, will you hear the twang of bowstrings? Will you see the flickering forms of the long-dead archers as they continue their ghostly march? The past is never truly gone, and the echoes of history can still be heard, even on the quietest of days, in the fields of Agincourt. The ghosts of Agincourt continue to haunt the fields where they once fought and died, their spectral arrows still cutting through the night air, their faces hidden behind the mists of time. For those who dare to visit the battlefield, the question remains, will you hear the twang of bowstrings or see the flicker of ghostly figures in the distance? The longbowmen of Agincourt may have won a decisive victory, but it seems that, even in death, their battle is not yet over. Whether they are trapped by the violent legacy of the 100 Years' War or bound to the fields where they changed the course of history, the phantom archers of Agincourt are a haunting reminder that the past is never truly gone. If you ever find yourself walking the fields of Agincourt at dusk, be sure to listen closely. You might just hear the distant sound of arrows in flight, or catch a glimpse of the ghosts who still fight on French soil.